Sorry, that's very formal. This meeting is now being recorded. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for our 5th Learning the Lessons DHR webinar. My name is Hannah Candy. I manage the Domestic Homicide Review team at Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse. Just a bit of housekeeping. As you heard, this is being recorded, so it will be available on our website, as are all of our previous webinars as well, in case you missed any of those. So feel free to introduce yourselves. We have the chat box is open, and we also have a separate tab Q&A. If you are able to please put any questions in the Q&A just to make sure that it doesn't get lost in the chat box, that would be wonderful. We are going to have time at the end for Sarah to answer some questions, so please be putting anything through and we'll do that. If you are tweeting today, you can see on the screen, hopefully, we have our hashtag and also the Standing Together account, as well as Sarah's. So please do tag us if you are tweeting throughout the day. If you have any questions that we don't get to, please do send us an email. We have our email up there. I'm sure we'll be more than happy to relay that over to Sarah and answer that outside. So please do note that down. Just to say, if anyone, this is their first time, maybe doesn't know Standing Together, we're a national charity whose aim is to end domestic abuse by changing the way local areas respond to it through an approach that we pioneered in the UK called the Coordinated Community Response. We believe that the coordinated community response is absolutely vital to ensure local systems truly keep survivors and any dependents safe, hold abusers to account, and ultimately to prevent domestic abuse. If you are interested in learning more about us, please do go to our website. I'm not going to talk about it anymore here, but if you're interested, please do go on. We have lots of different trainings and different teams and areas that we work in, so do get in touch. Today, I'm about to hand over. We have Sarah with us today. Sarah is absolutely wonderful. I've worked quite closely with her since coming over into this role just over a year ago. We both quality assure on the Home Office panel, and also she is the operations manager and deputy CEO at Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, which is a center for excellence for domestic homicide reviews. And she has a host of trainings and does a lot over there, but she also is doing her Winston Churchill Fellowship, which she's also going to talk to us about today, which is looking at models of reviewing non-homicide domestic abuse related deaths. And she's looking at Australia and the USA for that, I believe. So really excited to hear more from Sarah. So I'm not going to take up any more time and hand you straight over. So Sarah.
Thanks, Hannah. What an intro. Wow, I feel really quite special. Thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining us. It's really nice to see you all introducing yourself in the chat. I recognise some of your names. For some of you, there might be some repetition here, so apologies if that's the case, but please just bear with me. So I will start sharing my screen in a minute, but I just wanted to, I suppose, give a little bit of my background, sort of outside of my after work, really, or before it. So for many years I was the victim and witness services manager, running services in British Forces Germany and Cyprus for forces personnel and their families, and most of our referrals are really around domestic abuse and sexual violence. So I suppose my background is around that, giving that direct support to victims and survivors, but also to managing services. So that's very much my frame of reference and what I come to everything with. I'm not an academic researcher, although I really love research. That's not my background. So some of the things that I'll talk through today are from my experience as sort of practitioner and service manager, so to speak. It was actually the suicide of a woman that I was supporting, that prompted me to take a break from the sector. And so I did that, and I went to a really lovely wellbeing charity, and then really missed the work. So about 3.5 years ago, I joined AAFDA in originally an operations manager role, which has sort of become double-hatted to include the deputy chief exec role, as my role has broadened. As Hannah said, in that role, I'm part of the Home Office Quality Assurance Panel for Domestic Homicide Reviews, and I've read over, I think, about 300 reviews in that role and in my after role managing casework. At AAFDA, we have over 200 active cases. So for those of you that don't know, we offer advocacy and peer support to families bereaved by all forms of domestic abuse. So as I said, we've got over 200 active cases and over 70 domestic abuse related suicide cases. So as I said, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk you through some things today. So I wanted to start looking at the context of domestic abuse related suicide and what we know, a little bit about criminal justice outcomes, because I think it's really important that we consider the criminal justice lens. Some of the challenges of conducting what I'll call Domestic Homicide Reviews, DHRs, for want of a better term, and I know that's quite a blunt instrument term, so I do apologise. And also the work that I'm doing alongside my after work in this area. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Just forgive me a second. So hopefully you can now see that on full screen. No, sorry, I can notice it's actually not screen sharing very well. So I'm just going to try another way and see if that's a bit better. Hannah, could you just let me know if there's any problems with the screen share?
Yeah, it's not in presenter view.
No, it doesn't seem to want to move. I'm going to stop and try again, just in case.
Sorry.
It's no, it's my fault. It's just deciding to be tricky. Here we go. No, it wants to do it another way that I don't want it to do. Still not in presenter mode, is it?
Sorry, yeah, it's still not in presenter mode. Do you want to quickly send over to me and I can share it?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, everyone. As ever, it works until it doesn't work. I'm just going to try and get rid of closing things, Hannah, in case it's because it tried to do it once and then it was protesting. Is that better?
We can see the
notes section. How's that? Are we there?
Perfect, that's it.
Yay! Sorry, everyone. I think it's because I had my other screen on and it doesn't seem to like it. So that's my bad admin and not closing my bigger screen. So as I said, I wanted to start thinking about the scale really of the problem and what we know. So from research conducted elsewhere, back in 2004, Sylvia Walby extrapolated that 1/3 of all female suicide in England and Wales are partly caused by women having been subjected to domestic abuse. She also suggests that more women take their own lives each week than are killed. Obviously, that's quite an old piece of research now, 2004. However, I've spoken to Sylvia recently, and she feels that those numbers still hold. So I think they're quite shocking, really, if you're thinking about 1/3 and you're thinking about more women taking their own lives than are killed. And there are also many unexplained deaths, perhaps drug deaths, for example, that are written off, but should they be explored? Likely relate to domestic abuse in some way. Professor Jane Monckton-Smith is doing some work on these deaths she's calling hidden homicides, and we're working with a number of families in this area too. So more recently, Aitken and Monroe did a piece of work back in 2018. This study and its findings made a really significant contribution to what we know and really provides a much more robust evidence base with regards to the scale of suicidality in the context of domestic abuse. So this specific work, alongside Refuge, sampled 3,500 domestically abused adults from the Refuge client base. So 98% of those were women, which is unsurprising because of it's come from Refuge. And it also included 20 semi-structured interviews with practitioners. So what did this paper tell us? Well, it said that 24% reported positively to measures of suicidality. So they reported having felt suicidal, having made plans to end their own lives, or having made a suicide attempt. And that reflects a level of suicidality that's much higher than the general population. And this supports several studies that suggest that women who experience intimate partner abuse have been shown to be more likely than their non-abused counterparts to attempt suicide. So physical abuse, including strangulation, suffocation, psychological abuse, for example, isolation from friends and family, experiencing threats of harm, threats to family, and financial abuse all correlated with suicidality. And there were also, unsurprisingly, significant correlations between suicidality and additional needs in relation to both drugs and alcohol. I say unsurprisingly because I think any of us working in the sector would really recognise that. One refuge expert said we're more equipped to deal with the risk from the perpetrator than with the risk of self-harming or suicide. This paper also recognised it's more than likely that the findings underestimate the full scale of the problem, which is really scary. One of the things that I found really striking about this research is that the interview respondents, so that's to say the practitioners, estimated that anything between estimated suicidal ideation, anything from 20 to 80% of their cases, you know, which is a huge range and quite a frightening number, even if you look at that lower end. One of the sort of striking quotes was that those trapped by domestic abuse can feel so hopeless that they believe the only way out is suicide. I also wanted to touch on the Southfield Black Sisters Safe and Sane report. Again, it's quite old, 2010, but this showed that the rate of suicide, attempted suicide, suicidal ideation, and self-harm is disproportionately high amongst South Asian women. 62% of that sample group had contemplated, attempted suicide and self-harm, and the same group had showed a high correlation with domestic abuse. Again, the striking quote for me is that they felt that suicide is the tip of the iceberg and that for every woman that succeeds in taking their own life, there's many more in need of help. Aitken and Monroe's From Hoping to Help paper also suggested that ethnic minorities, immigrants and refugees have been positioned as more susceptible to domestic abuse related suicide as a consequence of cultural practices, concepts of honour and shame, and language or community barriers that prevent them from seeking help. I also really want to highlight some fantastic work that the Kent Public Health team have been doing recently around domestic abuse and suicide. They've done this drawing from published domestic homicide reviews and from some domestic homicide review information that they had access to from Kent and Medway itself, and also their real-time surveillance data. And they've used this to better understand some of the issues around domestic abuse and suicidality. And all of it came from essentially the Community Safety Partnership and Kent and Medway asking public health what seemed like a simple question of how many suicide DHRs can we expect to do in the next year. They've done a huge piece of work actually that's really interesting, and I would really encourage you to look that up. But one of their key findings, which is based on their real-time surveillance data from the whole of 2020 and from Q1 of 2021, is that over 20% of suspected suicides in Kent and Medway had been impacted by domestic abuse. And I think that was a number that surprised even them. I think it's really important though to say that this included perpetrators and victim suicide. So it was looking at suicide in the whole because they're looking at this information as it relates to suicide prevention. Finally, none of the academic literature that I've touched on here today speaks to male suicide where domestic abuse might be an antecedent. And whilst there is a wealth of research on male suicide, we know that suicide, or what we know about suicide is that it is gendered, is that there's none that I'm aware of that specifically considers the impact of domestic abuse on male suicidality. There's lots of discourse within some of the academic literature around family issues, relationship problems when we're talking about male suicide, but actually no further discussion into what that means or might mean. In considering really what we know, what's really highlighted is how many gaps there are. DHRs can't necessarily fill these gaps, these research gaps around scale, but what they can do is present us with far more information and intelligence and learning that can ensure that the services that we as a society are offering meet the needs of victims and really consider suicidality and risk of self-harm, as well as harm from an abuser. So it's really key in this information, and this learning is really key in terms of how we're looking at victims and survivors, how we're supporting them, what we're doing around perpetration, what's happening with suicide prevention, and what we're doing around risk assessment. So there's lots of learning that can really transform our responses to domestic abuse as a whole. And before I move on, I wanted to share this quote from Barbara Hart. This quote appeared in the American National Domestic Violence Fatality Review Initiative Winter Bulletin right back in 2010. And at the time, Barbara was the Director of Strategic Justice at the School of Public Service in Oregon. What she said still stands: suicide and suicide attempts occur below the radar of most professionals working to end violence against women. Incidence data are sketchy, risk markers are weak, screening tools are nascent, intervention strategies are vague, evidence-based practice is non-existent, even anecdotal wisdom is sparse. And to be honest, I'm not sure how much we've moved on from that since 2010. I also always feel it's useful to give an overview of the criminal justice outcomes as they relate to domestic abuse-related suicide. To give further context, there are a number of cases here on screen, and I'm just going to pull out a couple. So in 2017, Nicholas Allen was convicted of the manslaughter of Justine Rees, who took her own life. In the past, when I've presented about these criminal justice outcomes, people have asked why I include the name of the perpetrator, and that we should be focusing on the victim. And I agree the focus should be on the victim, but I also think it's really important to name the problem. And that's why I'm naming the perpetrators. It's important to note with this manslaughter conviction that Allen did plead guilty ahead of the trial. So the legal boundaries weren't really tested in this case. However, the fact that the Crown Prosecution Service took the decision to charge was really considered a huge leap forward. Justine's suicide note said that she'd run out of fight following Allen's campaign of stalking and abuse, which included 3,500 attempts to contact her by phone and text, the stalking of people close to her, contact with her son, employers of her friends. It was a really sustained campaign, and I think the DHR isn't far off publication, and it's certainly one that, whilst it's a really difficult read, I would signpost you to in terms of learning, because it paints a really frightening picture of stalking and really missed opportunities for interventions, and there's a huge amount of learning in that domestic homicide review. And actually really illustrates why it's really important that we're conducting domestic homicide reviews in these cases. In 2018, Stephen Game was convicted of coercive control, as well as a number of other charges around actual bodily harm and assault, after Kelly Sutton took her own life. What's important here to acknowledge is that the judge in his remarks suggested an acknowledgement of a causal link between the abuse and her death. And that's one of the issues around criminal justice outcomes in these cases. He said that Gaines' behaviour drove her to take her own life that morning, and that he beat her and ground her down and broke her spirits. And that really resonates with what a lot of our families that we work with at AAFDA tell us about, how their loved ones have taken their own lives to escape, and that it's not been a choice. They've not chosen to take their own lives, they've had no other option. So the Mark van Dongen case is interesting because His ex-girlfriend, Belina Wallace, was found guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent. Mark was very seriously injured and, with life-changing injuries. He took his own life. He died by euthanasia, in fact, voluntary euthanasia in Dignitas. And what was interesting there is that the doctors had sort of explained that there was a link between the attack and the impact it has had on his life and his decision then to end his life. This year, Peter Young was convicted of assault and again other charges after the death by suicide of Alex Reid. And also this year, Robert Holliday was found guilty of assault causing actual bodily harm and damage to property following the suicide of Abigail Patterson. Again, the judge here said it's clear that her family blame you for her death and her mental health had deteriorated since the last assault. They may well be right, but you've not been charged in a way that allows you to be blamed for her death. And a victim impact statement from her sister said she was worn down to the point where she blamed herself, worn down by you because of your behaviour. So it paints a really sad and tragic picture of the circumstances that all of these victims were living in that led them to take their own lives. Whilst these criminal justice outcomes are encouraging, they are still relatively rare. Munro and Aitken's paper from the Refuge study adding insult to injury actually discusses the criminal law's response to domestic abuse related suicide much further and is really interesting. I just want to take a moment to thank the Twitter account at we_r_Nina. Its creator has been documenting female suicide and collating cases since 2013. And that account really provides a wealth of information as well as highlighting some cases like these that might otherwise not be seen. So I want to acknowledge that she's been so helpful in giving me information, sharing information with me, but also the wider community around these deaths. And I'd really encourage you to follow that account. So having provided some context, which I hope has been useful in sort of setting the scene, essentially, I also, as we're here today to talk about learning lessons, I want to now focus on emerging best practice in domestic homicide reviews of suicides following domestic abuse, thinking first about community safety partnerships. And the word emerging is really, really key here. This is an emerging area of work. These reviews are really, really complex. And those of us that are working through these challenges and complexities to find the best practice, it's constantly developing as new issues are emerging, as new innovations reveal themselves. At AAFDA, as I said, we're now working with over 70 families who've lost a loved one to domestic abuse related suicide. I suppose I just want to caveat everything by saying I'm not the expert. I am just sort of highlighting some of the emerging practice that we're learning as an organisation and learning from my reading of domestic abuse related suicide DHRs. So firstly, why should we be commissioning a domestic homicide review for a suicide following domestic abuse? Many of you here will know that in 2016, the Home Office statutory guidance for the conduct of domestic homicide reviews was strengthened, which means that paragraph 18 now says where a victim took their own life, suicide, and the circumstances give rise to concern. For example, it emerges there was coercive controlling behaviour in the relationship, a review should be undertaken. And critically, it says, even if a suspect is not charged with an offence or they are tried and acquitted, reviews are not about who is culpable. So this is clear that in cases of suicide where there's been a previous history of domestic abuse, a DHR should be commissioned. However, we're not seeing the same level of reviews being commissioned as we're seeing deaths by suicide where domestic abuse is an antecedent. I know from talking to a lot of community safety partnerships, CSPs, that there are a number of very real and reasonable concerns around commissioning these reviews. So I wanted to touch on some of the issues that I hear. So firstly, language, and we all know how important language is. What do we call them? What do we call these reviews? Many CSPs tell us that the term domestic homicide review in itself causes them difficulty and can cause confusion. And the practice here is mixed for, like I said, quite fair and reasonable reasons. So in some areas, we still hear of reviews not being commissioned because they're not a homicide, and instead safeguarding adult reviews are being commissioned, which is clearly not best practice. But it does show that the word homicide in the title can feel problematic. We know too that in one area, the police force insisted that the review into a non-homicide domestic abuse related death was titled a domestic homicide review in order for the review to sit on a statutory footing to enable the legal team to feel comfortable sharing information. We also know from CSPs, from domestic homicide review chairs, that families can be really shocked and confused by the language. So, for example, if they receive a notification of the commissioning of a review, of course, there are families who have recognized the abuse and might feel very strongly that the word homicide is entirely appropriate. The term, though, can carry risk too. So, for example, it could alert someone who's under suspicion for a number of crimes, or give them concerns which might mean that they might present a further risk to others. Increasingly, we're seeing community safety partnerships use their own titles. So for these reviews, so for example, domestic abuse related death review, and that's in order really to navigate some of these difficulties and some of these challenges. I think what's really key is that the review itself follows the statutory guidance. Any change that's made is done in consultation with the Home Office. And it's really important that we guard against a change in review title leading to a fundamental change in the way that review is progressed. So it's imperative, for instance, that the review has an independent chair, that it's quality assured by the Home Office panel, and that it's published as appropriate. A title change really shouldn't mean a less robust internal review, and that's what we're seeing in some areas. We also know that risk is a really key consideration, and very rightly so. Experienced domestic homicide review chair Eleanor Stobart suggests that a risk assessment at a really early stage of the review process is key, and that the entire process should be considered with risk in mind, and almost with sort of a risk lens. So, for example, this might include thinking about who the family is. So, could one or more of them, in the case of honour-based abuse, be under criminal investigation, for example? When the community safety partnership is notifying the family of a domestic homicide review, who's being notified? Also, commissioners need to consider the risk to the reviewers and the chair in conducting a review where the purpose is to identify and perhaps uncover the trail of abuse. So whilst we all know that domestic homicide reviews aren't about culpability and blame, there is always the possibility that a probing, curious review will uncover information that was not previously known, and that might well impact on future investigations. I have known of a couple of reviews where the information that's been uncovered has then been passed back to the police to reinvestigate. When we're thinking about publication, often the Home Office Quality Assurance Panel, as Hannah will tell you, is asked to consider non-publication of these reviews. And this is often due to the risk that I've already spoken about, and also the risk to other contributors to the review. So that might be children, and to family. But this has to be really carefully balanced with sharing learning. Often community safety partnerships suggest they'll hold a local learning event to share the learning from DHRs, but it often means that learning, recommendations and actions aren't shared more widely. So we often see solid, probing reports that have taken considerable time and effort and energy from a domestic homicide review panel and chair that reach a relatively small audience. And in my view, we should really publish as much as we can whilst considering and mitigating risk and finding innovative ways to do that, so that the learning that we've discovered can be used to change our ways of working. Anonymity and risk has to lead the thinking when we're considering publication. But I do think there's innovative ways that we can do it in a way that can share learning more widely. And I think it's just about us thinking a little bit differently, perhaps on how we publish and what the document published looks like. But is there a way that we can publish something that can really share the learning with other areas before they have to start undergoing their own reviews to learn? I absolutely understand that commissioning and delivering these reviews is really challenging for community safety partnerships, and that can mean that they're reluctant, instead preferring, for instance, the safeguarding adult review. And this perhaps is my key takeaway to anyone working within the CSP today. These DHRs really offer valuable and unique learning, which is really distinct in many cases from any other domestic abuse related deaths, such as an intimate partner homicide or even any adult family homicides. And they offer really key learning to potentially feed into other areas. So as I mentioned before, public health and suicide prevention strategies. So I now want to sort of spend a little bit of time thinking about domestic homicide review chairs and panel members. Again, when we're talking about best practice here, we need to ensure that we've got an overarching eye on risk. For example, and this is just one, we need to consider the risk to those contributors to the review. So that's the friends, family, employers, and member of the wider community. For example, in sharing the information they share with us or with the Domestic Homicide Review panel, are we putting them at risk? If there is an alleged perpetrator who is within the community, how do we mitigate that risk? And these are really difficult questions. They're difficult challenges, but I do believe that we can overcome them. So in this instance, could we give a summary overview of information that's been gathered from those people as a whole, to ensure that we're including key information that supports our learning and recommendations, but does offer some protection to those individuals? Again, another really key and tricky issue is the involvement of family, as I've touched on. Who's the family? So David Warren, he's a really experienced Domestic Homicide Review chair, and he's done particularly a number of suicide DHRs. In a previous webinar that we hosted at AAFDA, he raised some really interesting points about the involvement of families in these reviews. In a review he'd worked on, there were really specific challenges where a husband of the victim was the next of kin, whilst also being the alleged abuser. And this meant that he was the contact point for the chair to collect personal documentation such as diaries, photos, her computer, etc. And clearly this created real challenge. And eventually many of these documents had to be obtained elsewhere from other family members and actually from the police. And we might here also need to consider inviting family members to meet with the DHR panel. Normally, as an advocacy organisation, we would say, yes, the family, as per the guidance, should be invited to meet the panel, or should have the opportunity to meet the panel. But in these suicide DHRs, if we invite one family member, must we invite all? And again, does that mean, potentially, that we might be inviting the alleged abuser? And again, these are really difficult considerations that we need to look at with a risk lens and on a case-by-case basis. Disclosure in and of itself can be potentially really challenging in these cases, and something that we're all really mindful of. Our advocates at AAFDA have had lots of training on this from legal professionals because it's a really key consideration in our work here. And I wanted as well to touch on inviting perpetrator families into the review. There's little practice that I've seen at the moment, so it's something we need to continue to think about and to consider how we can innovate, because actually alleged perpetrators' families might also hold key information that can really help us to develop recommendations and learning. I think one of the things that's really key again here is language. So it might not be appropriate to use the word perpetrator, for instance, as we might see in a review where the death is a homicide. So for many, the word perpetrator can be loaded with a sense of culpability and criminality. I've seen a number of approaches, including using sort of perpetrator of abuse at the start of the review and then using pseudonyms throughout. The Home Office statutory guidance does feel a little bit at odds here with these suicide reviews because that perpetrator language is used throughout. But we do recognise that the guidance doesn't entirely fit for suicide DHRs, and many community safety partnerships and chairs do tell us that they'd be really grateful for strengthening of the guidance for suicide reviews. And as part of our ongoing work with the Home Office, we are raising these difficulties, but until changes are made, which might be a way off, reviewers do need to be mindful of some of the challenges around language and find ways to navigate them. So I think as I've touched on, really, these reviews are supremely challenging, and the best suicide reviews that I've seen really skillfully balance curiosity and probing with sensitivity and caution. And they required DHR chairs and panels and CSPs to navigate really difficult questions and considerations. And as I mentioned earlier, these reviews do offer a real opportunity to learn, and learning that can be very distinct from the learning that we might see from other domestic abuse related deaths, like an intimate partner homicide. And as such, there's an opportunity really for recommendations and the subsequent action planning to be much broader. So, for example, what are the recommendations for public health and for suicide prevention strategies, both locally and nationally? And in my experience, we're perhaps not seeing enough of this in these reviews, which is something we'd really like to encourage. I wanted to touch on briefly best practice around advocacy and families, really. Again, it's really challenging, distinctly challenging from work with other domestic abuse related deaths. Families bereaved by domestic abuse related suicide are often left with little or no support in the aftermath of a suicide of their loved one, yet they're often navigating the same statutory reviews that follow these deaths. So in some cases, they're navigating domestic homicide reviews. In all cases, they're navigating an inquest. And in many cases, families are also trying to engage with police and trying to engage the police to investigate more fully. Families tell us that suicide following domestic abuse is really distinct from other suicide bereavement. So many have accessed suicide support groups or forums, for example, but they say that they feel really much more closely aligned with families bereaved by domestic homicide, and it's that abuse that their loved one suffered in their life that really compounds the trauma of the death by suicide. Our specialist and expert advocates are often making representations with regards to police investigations, the commissioning of domestic homicide reviews, and ensuring that coroners are aware of potential DHRs and ensuring that inquests are adjourned. And they're also often navigating complex families and risk where the alleged perpetrator of the abuse is in the community and potentially still surrounding the family. I think I really want to sort of highlight the difficulty around police investigation at the moment. We know from our experience working with those 70+ families that the police investigation into these cases is often limited. The crime scene is not being secured, evidence is not being secured. The approach is that of a suicide without really necessarily always looking at the history and what might be able to be charged based on that. So that's why we see so few criminal justice outcomes. As an organisation, we've written to the National Police Chief Council on the issue. We've also raised it in our Violence Against Women and Girls consultation submission. And we'll continue to campaign and advocate on this for improvements, both in our frontline work and our wider campaign work, to ensure the best possible outcomes for families. I think one of the most shocking things I heard was from a family who was trying to get a police investigation into the death by suicide of their loved one and the history, the domestic abuse history surrounding it. And they were told by the police officer that they were focusing on live victims, which was really, really difficult for the family to hear, and also raises real concerns because we've got an alleged perpetrator still at large who can go on to perpetrate abuse against another victim. I just wanted to add that advocates can be a really key part of best practice in suicide domestic homicide reviews. They can really support community safety partnerships and DHR chairs and panels to navigate some of the challenges that I've highlighted. You know, they're working on lots of these reviews. Their ability to support, inform and guide families to manage expectations and can ensure that the process can progress far more easily. And they can also play a really key role in drawing out the domestic abuse that existed. In some cases, families don't necessarily recognise all of the behaviours that we might as experts in domestic abuse. So they might say, oh, he was never violent, and they might not recognise any financial control or the isolation from friends and family. So it's really, that's where the advocate can really engage with them to help to draw that out, which then helps the chair and the panel with the review itself. To identify that learning really and those recommendations. I'm really mindful that I'm just talking at you and I can see chat coming in, but I can't read it. So I'm going to forge on now and just talk a little bit about my Churchill Fellowship that Hannah touched on. So this is a little hobby outside of my after work. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Churchill Fellowship, the fellowship was created back in 1965 as the living legacy of Sir Winston Churchill. And the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust runs Churchill Fellowships, and these are a really unique programme of overseas research grants, which support individuals from all parts of society to travel the world in search of innovative solutions for pressing societal problems. Every year, around 150 fellowships are awarded for people to travel for 4 to 8 weeks anywhere in the world, researching a topic of their choice. And then on their return, the Trust helps fellows to share learning with professionals and communities across the UK. So it's about going away and gathering lots of info and bringing it back to help us to do things better here. So I was awarded my fellowship in March 2020, just days before lockdown. And the aim of my fellowship is to explore how death reviews abroad are tackling non-homicide domestic abuse related deaths, which is catchy as a title. I want to focus specifically on suicide, but I will look more broadly at unexplained deaths. And then look at what changes we can make to the model here, or what changes we can recommend to the model here in England and Wales to maximise learning. So this fellowship seed was planted for me back in 2019. Firstly, from a family member who I'd worked really closely with. Her daughter took her own life after a campaign of domestic abuse that left her broken. And alongside the battle to get a domestic homicide review commissioned, her mum was also battling a lack of understanding of the issues from statutory agencies and the stigma that families often feel after suicide. Excuse me 1 minute, I'm just gonna let the dog out of the office. She's scratching and being a terrible pain. Sorry, the joys of working from home. And as I mentioned earlier, this mum really felt that general suicide bereavement support just didn't meet her needs. It didn't recognise the abuse that had come before the death, that had impacted on the whole family. And she felt that she fit more closely and felt more part of the group of families who'd been bereaved by domestic homicide. She talked to me about feeling that her daughter was invisible and erased by the state, not counted, and that her experiences weren't recognised. And that really stuck with me. And I also made a commitment to her that I'd do everything that I could to see women like her daughter counted. And I'd also been working with Julie Oranger, and some of you may have heard her speak. Her daughter, Katie Wilding, died in unexplained circumstances alongside her abusive partner. We worked for 3 years to get a domestic homicide review commissioned into Katie's death. And again, it was another death that just wasn't being counted or acknowledged as being from domestic abuse. And then in September of 2019, I delivered a workshop at the European Conference on Domestic Violence in Oslo, and it was focused on this issue, these invisible domestic abuse related deaths. And what struck me at the time was the reaction of many of the delegates who came from across the world, and the discussion that we had there about the lack of reviewing happening of these deaths in their countries. So I remember an academic from Canada sort of sat there thinking and saying to us, oh my God, we've got all these deaths of women from the indigenous population and all these suicide deaths, and no one's looking at the history, no one's actually counting them. And thinking about how domestic abuse may have impacted on those women. And so I came home and started sort of mad researching what was happening in the world around these reviews, who's conducting them, how are they doing it? And from that, I applied for the fellowship. And, you know, I suppose like lots of people here, you might think, you know, why would I be successful in being awarded a fellowship? And, you know, complete imposter syndrome. I was sat there looking at all the people I knew who were fellows. So Goody from Standing Together, Nick Sharp, Jeffs, James Rowland, and that's just within the sector. And thinking, why would I be successful? But I would encourage anyone to apply, because why not? Why wouldn't you be successful if you've got an idea that needs addressing? So I really sort of wanted to understand what's happening elsewhere, so that we can learn and have the best review process possible that leads to real change, particularly around how we share learning, because we know, all of us know, that is a challenge here at the moment. We're not very good at sharing learning. So I plan, as Hannah said, to go to Australia and the US to look at the way that reviews are developing there, are undertaken, and critically, how findings from the reviews are disseminated. And my aim is to evaluate how the models that are used elsewhere could be incorporated or adapted, and to examine the potential to develop a really world-leading model in England and Wales that not only fully reviews domestic homicide, but also domestic abuse-related suicide, and then shares learning to transform the responses for victims living with domestic abuse in order to prevent future death. We know that, as I said, current reviewing at home around these deaths can be a real postcode lottery in terms of commissioning and the sharing of learning, and the learning's rarely shared at a national level, sorry. And we also know that the guidance, as I said, needs strengthening. But what else can we learn about best practice from colleagues elsewhere? So COVID has somewhat delayed my fellowship and my travel, but I've been using the time to continue to read every suicide DHR I can get hold of, and to build contacts in Australia and the US, and to start to have some of those initial conversations. In reality, I don't think I'll be able to travel until the summer of 2022, but I'd hope that by sort of early 23, which seems an unbearably long time off, I'll be able to produce a report on my findings and to share some clear recommendations of how we might strengthen reviews here. So whilst my fellowship's somewhat on hold, I'm not sort of standing still or resting on my laurels. So as I mentioned, after we're continuing to develop and share emerging best practice in conducting suicide DHRs, which means working really closely with chairs and CSPs and crucially families to understand how we get the very best out of these reviews, so that they really acknowledge the experiences of victims, and think about how we not only transform responses for victims and survivors, but how we manage perpetrators, how we link learning with public health teams and suicide prevention. And we've also brought together a working group on the issue. This is very much in its infancy, but it's made up of individuals from a wide range of organisations across sectors. So, for example, legal, public health, suicide prevention, domestic abuse, health. And the aim of this group is to come together to share information. There's some great work being done out there, and also to look at ways we can come together to influence policy and change, be that around government strategy or police investigation, for example. And finally, I'm in the very early days of looking at emerging themes from published DHRs. At the moment, it's still quite a small sample group, but one that is building and growing. And whilst there has been analysis on published DHRs, more generally, for example, Standing Together's report last year, there hasn't been any specific analysis of suicide DHRs. So whilst I said it's in its early days, I haven't started any in-depth analysis as yet. I've been drawing out some interesting points that we can start to address. So a couple of weeks ago, I spoke at the Hope Call that MENA organises, and I know many of you will have been to that. And I was looking at the representation of Black and minoritized victims in suicide DHRs. And as I said, I currently hold a small sample, but there is actually lots of missing information in terms of data collection around ethnicity. So in 53% of the DHRs that I currently hold, ethnicity isn't even stated. And in 26% it's stated as white British, 11% as British Sikh, 5% as white, 5% as dual heritage, whatever that might mean. And this, alongside the lack of suicide DHRs being seen at the Home Office Quality Assurance Panel, does suggest that the process isn't working as it should when we're considering Black and minoritized victims. And we're seeing this too at AAFDA in our levels of engagement with Black and minoritized families. And again, that supports the work and the findings from the Standing Together report that analysed London DHRs that highlighted key issues around Black and minoritized victims, including immigration status being a barrier, DHR panels not taking an intersectional approach. So already, just from that very sort of scratch the surface bit of work I'm doing there, we're starting to find bits of learning and information that we can take now to help to better engage, for instance, just with families. So I am really mindful I've talked at you for far too long, so I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions.
Sarah, that was just so interesting. Thank you so much. It didn't feel like you were talking at all, by the way. It's just
did to me.
It's so interesting to hear about all of the best practice that you're seeing, all of the research that you've mentioned. Lots of people have been putting in the chat, and we also have some questions lined up. If anyone does have any questions, please do put in the QA box, just because it can get a little bit lost in the chat. So I'll just start with James's question, if that's all right. So first of all, he said, hello, thank you for your talk. It's always great to hear about such an important area. And he said, one issue that DHRs struggle with is whether or not to speak with the partner / ex-partner who is not the perpetrator, as you would have in an intimate partner homicide, but is the alleged perpetrator of domestic abuse more generally. This raises a whole host of issues from information sharing to risk. Do you have any views on best practice in this area?
I think it's really, I'm not sure we're there on best practice, to be honest. I think individual DHRs are finding their way and taking it on a case-by-case basis. I think some of the difficulties we're seeing about involving the alleged perpetrator of abuse is that you obviously then have the risk of, as you do in an intimate partner homicide review, is of the perpetrator controlling the narrative. But we know that good chairs can manage that. They manage that in intimate partner homicide review. So it feels like that can be managed. And actually, again, it speaks to looking at things more broadly. We have to address perpetration, particularly in these cases where their likelihood is we don't have a criminal conviction, people aren't in prison, people are in the community, and therefore we know that there is probably going to be another victim. So for me, there's a real learning there, but I recognize it's tricky. And because I think people are still really, really frightened, and I understand them being frightened of talking to perpetrators, we're not seeing a huge amount of it. So I'm sorry. I think it is case by case. And I think it's about best judgment of those chairs. And so many of those chairs are brilliant and the chairs and the panels can take that judgment. Does that answer the question, James?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of those things where it's definitely one where at Standing Together, sometimes you do struggle with it, but it is case by case you have to work through. And this kind of leads on to another one, because as I think you mentioned, and we know, there's some Home Office guidance that's being renewed, and we're all kind of, I think, hoping that some more suicide guidance is going to be part of that. But so someone has asked, can you give any advice about kind of realistic steps that CSPs, panel members, etc., could take now while that guidance is being reviewed?
I think so. Some of the emerging best practice that we've identified today, I think the key thing is that idea of risk and really considering risk, because so one of the things I find feels a little bit odd to me is that the guidance would tell you that DHR panel members should be named, their positions and their organisations, and Hannah will know we highlight that in reviews where we don't see that, because when you don't see the job title, for instance, you can't be assured that there are sufficient seniority to be on that panel. So that's an important part of the guidance, and that's important when we're quality assuring. But that is published. So, I think that then leads to a question for me is that appropriate in a suicide review when you have an alleged perpetrator potentially who has more access? We know that if they're published, the perpetrator, even an intimate partner homicide, can have access. But as I said, often they're in prison or they're not in a position to be necessarily a risk. So for me, that's something that feels a little bit at odds. And that's the kind of thing we need to navigate. So that would be sort of one of the things that you might be able to address. So is it that it's published, but that is actually redacted, but that the panel see it so they can be assured that there are sufficient seniority? So I think we have to be a bit creative, and I'm like the least creative person on earth, but I think we need to be a bit creative in what we do. And also where you feel uncomfortable as a CSP around risk, or as a chair, I would say highlight that to the Home Office. We need to keep feeding it in. And then we can work out ways that we can publish or redact or do what we need to do to share the lessons in a safe way. So I think it's just being innovative until we have a little bit more strength in the guidance around suicide.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as well what you've said about when panels or chairs do decide to kind of do something different, like you said, it's important for the Home Office panel to know that was kind of considered in a thought. But like you've said, sometimes you just need to be a bit creative with things and make your way until we figure out the best way of doing things.
Yeah.
So the next question is, and this was kind of going on in the chat as well, do you have any more kind of advice about how you think perpetrators should be named in suicide DHRs? Is perpetrator of domestic abuse the preferred term, or how would you think that it's best to kind of name, I suppose?
I think you'll hear lots of conflicting views from the readers at the Home Office and from QA panel members. For me, I don't feel that the word perpetrator holds a great deal of culpability, criminality in my head, the term, but others do. So that's something, and someone said to me, I think it was a coroner said to me the other day, that feels like a difficult term for them as well. So I think it's about recognizing that. I think some of the best ways I've seen it done is alleged perpetrator of abuse, John, at the beginning, and then call him John throughout, which sort of takes away that difficulty with using perpetrator and victim, is to get those pseudonyms in at an early point, and perhaps something even just explaining why you have chosen those terms, because I think that at the moment there is no prescriptive way to do that in the guidance. So again, we have to find our way the best we can. It's sort of, and using the best practice that's emerging. So for me, that's probably what I would like to see at the moment. I don't know though, Hannah might feel slightly, she might have a different hat on as part of the quality assurance panel.
To be fair, I'm in agreement with you. I think pseudonyms are always safe, aren't they? And I think same as you, sometimes we use perpetrator in a different way in the sector than other professions, and other people might view that term. But I think what you said, yeah, I would agree with that, to be fair. So the next one, I'm going to try to, I'm not sure if this was a question, but first of all, thank you for your valuable work. I work with IRIS, who collect data on suicides, which are a result of domestic violence and abuse. We train GPs and clinicians to look out for indicators of DA so they can refer to IRIS for support to prevent suicide. IRIS has found that women would like their GPs to ask them about DA, and that DA is a health issue. And I guess kind of just going further to that, it's interesting kind of what's coming out of those suicide DHRs, and you are finding things like that. And so I don't know if you have anything to speak on. The IRIS are looking at DA as a health issue with regards to suicidality.
Yeah, I was actually just, Medina and I, the chief executive of RSI, were just in touch last week. Actually, we're going to have a more in-depth chat about it. It is absolutely a health issue. One of the things we would have really liked to have done is to input into the women's health strategy consultation on this issue. But in reality, after working tier 1 and tier 2 organisation, we just don't have the resource to feed into everything we'd like. And part of that is why we formed this sort of suicide working group to, as a group, share the load, so to speak. But I know the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office were looking to feed domestic abuse related suicide into the piece of work they're doing around the women's health strategy. It is a health issue, and it's a public health issue as well. And I think I'm really interested in, I didn't used to be, but I'm becoming more interested in the work that Kent are doing around perpetrator suicide as well. I've always been very, very victim focused, but actually, I think we have to look at that side as well. So those perpetrator suicides are interesting too, and there must be things we can learn there. So again, that feeds into that public health piece. So I think health and public health are really important. I know Tim from Public Health in Kent and Medway, who did that piece of work alongside his colleague Megan, were talking to the Department of Health on it, but that was tricky.
And that piece of work, is that published? I'm just thinking if we can pop in the chat.
It isn't published, but I do have the slides that Tim will, I'm sure, be more than happy to let me share, so I could send it on to you, Hannah, if you wanted to then send out.
Grand, thank you.
It's really amazing work.
Sounds really interesting, and I know we were just discussing that the other day, so it'd be really interesting.
It's really great.
So what would you ideally want to see the Home Office prioritise in the review of guidance for DA-related suicides and DHR?
I think really it's about strength. The guidance feels, suicide was added because it was really important, and it was an addition at the time. But I think perhaps, and I wasn't around at the time, perhaps there wasn't the time or the capacity to sort of work that and weave that through the entirety of the guidance. So I suppose that's what I would like to see, is that I don't think it needs to be separate guidance. I think that sort of becomes quite complex. So I think that there's an opportunity perhaps to have a specific section just to offer CSPs and chairs more, and some help with addressing these difficulties and complexities. And I think we know here time and time again that everyone wants the name changed, but actually that requires a sort of a legislative change, which is a bit more difficult and more time consuming. I think the positive thing about potentially the review of the guidance that's taking place is that ministers now are really interested in domestic homicide reviews. So there is definitely an appetite to do that. So I think really it's about weaving suicide reviews throughout, as opposed to at the moment where it's quite it's quite a small addition, and then some of the terms like perpetrator that are used throughout just don't feel like they fit, and that leads to the ambiguity, I think, and the difficulty for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can put in my 2 cents, I think it would be great if the kind of information sharing parameters were made a bit clearer for the suicide cases, because we definitely bring into complications around that. So it would be great, like you said, though, if it's kind of woven through to explain, for DHRs, but also for suicide DHRs. But yeah, absolutely. I think what you've said is spot on. We just need it to be kind of woven through and given advice, really.
Yeah.
So we've got 4 more, so we'll try to get through all these, and if anyone else, we'll see how many we can get through. So hi Sarah, good presentation. Have you been involved in any older adult regarding homicide, especially related to dementia or other mental health conditions? So I suppose just kind of your thoughts around that. And just to quickly signpost, our last session was on mental health with Dr. Marilla Kalcha. So if you are interested in that, we also have that posted on our website, but also Sarah, please do.
And she's fantastic.
Thoughts on
I have
that?
to say, yeah. So again, actually, after we did our last free webinar on domestic homicide reviews in older people, I think we're seeing lots of them, lots more at panel, not just around intimate partner, but also sort of adult parent violence. I know Professor Neil Websdale in the US is doing work on these reviews as they relate to dementia. So there are quite a few out there. And there are, as Hannah will tell you, we've been reading quite a lot of panel around older people. Definitely an area of concern, I would say. I don't know if we're seeing more because more are being commissioned, or if we're seeing more because more are happening, and that's why we just don't have the data to be able to make that judgment. But certainly we know that services for older people don't meet their needs, and there's lots of barriers. So there is some good learning coming out of those reviews. And obviously, Hannah Bowes and Susan Bembo have done some work on those DHRs and analysing those DHRs.
Grand, thank you. So the next one, I'm just going to read out. So what you've said about the skills of a good chair to unpick an alleged perpetrator's narratives in a suicide review is really interesting, because I think the amount of victim blaming that can be found in a DHR report where there's an identified perpetrator responsible for the death. How can we ensure that chairs/panels hold perpetrators to account, especially when they're able to control the narrative, as you've mentioned?
I think, when we're thinking about victim blaming language, that really is in the gift of the chair and the panel. I would say as a panel member, if you're seeing victim blaming language that you're unhappy with in the report, you need to challenge and highlight that language. I think we've all got a responsibility to do that. And we certainly do it at Quality Assurance Panel. I know that's something we look out for a lot. I think, as we've said today, language is really, really important. And I think the way that it's about focusing, isn't it, the DHR on the voice of the victim and the victim's narrative, and how they, their experiences, and acknowledging them and really recognizing life through their eyes. And that's what we should be doing through a domestic homicide review, so that we can understand how we could have done better. So I think we need to be careful when we're talking about perpetrators and about their narrative. But as I said before, I think it is important. It's an important part of the puzzle. You can't look at the end without looking, you can't look at the effect without looking at the cause.
Yeah, so and I think as well, it's just spot on. We are looking out at the QA panel, aren't we, for any kind of victim blaming language, but you do kind of hope that as panel members and as chairs that you have sign off of that. So hopefully it doesn't get to the QA panel before it's kind of fed back in that way, but absolutely. Next question. So what are your thoughts on having the chair and the author as the same person for the DHR? Categorically it poses as terrible governance, and in addition can add to the length of a review, as they control what happens at each panel meeting, and then the review is written at their own pace, normally within 4 to 5 panel meetings, whereas 2 is more than sufficient. So is that 2 panel meetings, I'm thinking. So I suppose perhaps then what's your thought on having the chair and author be the same, and around the number of panel meetings that we would be looking to have?
I have to say, I don't see a difficulty with the chair and the author being the same. I think it's a difficult job to be able to chair meetings and facilitate those conversations and also write the review. But we see some people do that very, very successfully. There's some excellent chairs out there. I know, so I don't see a problem there. There are a number of partnerships that work together as chair and author, and they split those roles and they work very successfully as well. And obviously there's something in their working relationship that makes them work as a review author and chair. In terms of panel meetings, I mean, I think it's very much based on the circumstances of each individual review. I don't think we can be prescriptive, because we need to be looking at each review in its unique circumstance, and some are really, really, really complex. They're all horrendous and they're all difficult, but some are really far more complex than others, which is why you see some 80-page reviews and some 300-page reviews. I would say 2 meetings is too little. When you just think about the process of a DHR, that doesn't seem enough to actually be able to have that open conversation and discourse, which I think is really, really essential in a DHR. I think you would struggle to do that in 2 meetings. So for me, I think 3, and I think the guidance says 3 is the minimum, but realistically, I think we're probably looking at 3 to 6. I've seen in excess of 10 where it's been a really complex DHR and it's been necessary. But I think, 2 for me would feel like too light.
Yeah, I think I would be in agreement. And I also wonder if it's feeling like the chair is holding some sort of power that feels uncomfortable as a panel member, then perhaps that's something that needs to have a discussion kind of as a panel, because I don't know, personally, I think that really everyone should have semi-equal footing, obviously not exact, perhaps equal, but if you're feeling like it's the chair's show, that's probably not the way it should be, because really it is the panel's report at the end of the day, and it's your local area that's going to have to deliver it.
Yeah, and as I always say to panel members, your name is going on that report, so you want that report to be something that you're happy for your name to be attached to. So if there's, I know it can be difficult to challenge in that panel situation, but I think it's really necessarily that you do, if you do feel that a chair is being dominant or imposing their own view on something, or if a panel member, it might be a panel member who's being dominant, but actually your name is going on that review, so make it something that you're proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next one, first of all, this is fascinating. So in the DHR that they've recently been involved with, where a young woman took her own life, the alleged perpetrator refused to be involved because he felt that he was being accused of her death. To me, this showed his guilt and perhaps shows the problem with the language we use, but I just can't think of any alternative terminologies that would feel more acceptable.
And I think, a DHR isn't about culpability. So unfortunately, or fortunately, it's not a place where we're actually assessing their guilt or otherwise. That's for the police and for the criminal justice system to do, I think. But what we can do is give that victim a voice and tell their story. That's a voice that's been taken away from them. So I think that's the real opportunity there, is to change that narrative and actually move it away from him or her, as it is in some cases, and focus it on the victim.
Thank you. And the last question, which if people have more, please do put through, is around, can the application for a suicide DHR be made after the inquest? You mentioned one that took 3 years to get, and I guess my personal kind of follow-up is it would be really interesting, I think, to hear about, because I know that AAFDA has helped families advocate for suicide reviews, ones that also happened kind of earlier before the guidance. So it would be really interesting to hear a little bit about kind of that process about trying to get ones done when they haven't been originally commissioned, I suppose.
Yeah, some are easier than others. So for more recent deaths, we would just directly approach the community safety partnership, and the guidance is quite clear that it doesn't have to be the police that tells the CSP about the death. So we notify the CSP about the death and ask them to consider the review for a DHR. That can happen after the inquest. The concern obviously there is that the coroner then doesn't have necessarily all the information that might be really helpful to them, but that does happen. With historic cases, it's more difficult. In Katie Wilding's case, so Julie didn't know that such a thing existed as a domestic homicide review. The inquest was joint, Katie and the perpetrator, and I will call him a perpetrator. He was on bail for an assault against her. She was Maracked. She was considered a high-risk victim. She'd given an ABE to police about the abuse. So he was a perpetrator. That case was really difficult to get commissioned because the CSP felt very strongly that it wasn't a domestic homicide review. And it's taken a lot of work to get there. But I think we now, there's a really excellent chair in place, and we now feel quite confident. I think most importantly, the family feel confident that the review will be thorough and probing. And it's not about blaming people. You know, there's already been police complaints, 4 or 5 been upheld. We don't need to do that. That's been done. But it's about really understanding what happened to Katie, and preventing it happening from someone else, really.
Thank you. And I have a question as well. Can you tell us more about the Winston Churchill? And you mentioned kind of there was someone from Australia, I think you said, that was at your talk in Oslo that kind of thought, we're going away, we're not having these. So what systems are there in place? If maybe it's too early on to say, but it'd be really interesting just kind of hear more about a little sneak peek around what they do with suicide or non-homicide related domestic abuse deaths.
So it was Canada that sort of talked about their Indigenous population deaths, so like the Inuit population in particular. And it was just like a light bulb went on actually in the room, which was quite interesting. And loads of countries were then like, you know, oh, what do we do? You know, so that was a brilliant moment. And we've you know, I've sort of stayed in touch to understand what's happening there. So Australia, each area works differently in the different areas in Australia. A lot of the reviewing is done through the coroner's court there with a standing panel. And in some of them, they almost have, they have a banding system for how they review deaths, suicide deaths, so that they then review proportionally based on banding. They also some areas do thematic reviews, so they don't, as we do individual reviews about Katie, for example. I know Julie won't mind me using her name. So, but they might look at a group of women that have taken their own lives and then produce a thematic review on that. They've been doing quite a lot of work on, again, the Indigenous population, particularly the suicide of children who are in living with abuse in their homes. So they're doing quite a lot of work there. So but what's amazing about Australia is the way that they share that information. So they sort of have annual reviews that come out from various sort of big organizations nationally that are, as I said, each year producing information, recommendations, actions, and that's a really key difference. But I suppose what I need to then go and find out is what happens with that. So it's great putting out something national, which we're not doing, and we know makes things more difficult for local areas because they're having to learn through their own reviews rather than from reviews that are being done elsewhere. But what I'm keen to understand is how is that translating actually to services on the ground? Because it's great to have that national dissemination, but actually if it isn't impacting on services on the ground, then they're no better off than we are, really. So that's what I need to get in and dig in on. The US is quite difficult to get a lot of information out of because of their privacy laws. So there's not like a wealth of information online. So most of my information comes from talking to Professor Neil Websdale, who's sort of seen as the world guru on these issues. But he sort of tells me that they get into a room, like a panel of people get into a room and talk it out, which is quite different to how we do it. And a lot of these reviews then go through the Centre for Disease Control, oddly enough, because it's public health. So again, and their states each work differently. So again, very, very different picture to the picture here. But what I'm really keen there is to see how they're linking up with mental health and justice. So yeah, I mean, there's loads that I need to get into, and I'm sort of just on the periphery at the moment of digging in.
Oh,
just need to get there.
Really interesting. I can't wait to hear about what you find. And I think as well the kind of look of the impact. So what happens afterwards, I think is just so crucial, and it's something that I think over here we could be looking at a bit more as well. So it sounds very interesting. I can't wait to see what you find out.
I'm really excited, but also a little bit exhausted already thinking about writing a report afterwards. But yeah, I think, you know, it's those little, it's not about adopting someone else's approach really, because actually we're world leaders in the fact that we're doing these reviews. And I sort of want to remind everyone, as much as we've got all the difficulties and all of the negativity that can come out around DHRs, we are really closely examining the deaths of individuals for learning. And I think that's really important. The time and money that's spent, is a real acknowledgement of their lives. So it's not about adopting someone else's approach, but it's about taking learning from others' approach to really enhance our own, so that we are really world leading, and that people like Canada or Portugal or Norway can look at us and go, that's what we want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And just again, another shameless plug to anyone that's interested. James Rowlands did his Winston Churchill Fellowship looking at the DHR or relevant, same as DHR, but not always called a DHR, across a few different countries, including America and Australia. And so his paper either can look up and read. I think it's linked on our website as well, on the same area where it had when he did his talk. So if you are interested to learn more about the kind of processes that happen in different countries, and like Sarah said, it really does highlight what this country does is quite unique in the kind of deep dive, looking at what missed opportunities there were within a specific case.
James's report is brilliant, so I would definitely signpost people to read that.
Yes, I can also attest to that. Please do. We can send around the link when
we'll read James's report.
Basically, we'll just send a bunch of signposting in the thank you for coming email.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's any other questions, but if not, a lot of people have been putting in the chat basically just saying thank you. This is so useful, extremely helpful and insightful. In essence, just thanking you, Sarah. And I'm going to absolutely echo that. It's been an absolute pleasure hearing about your thoughts and expertise and emerging best practice. It's one of those things, there is a bit to go before we are getting it right, but it is really useful to know that there is coming out better and better practice and what we're doing with these and what to happen next. So I just want to say thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for coming in Monday after Monday.
A heavy Sunday night, everyone, yeah.
I shouldn't mention it perhaps, but thank you guys for coming. Hopefully everyone found it useful. We don't have a next one scheduled as of yet, but once we do, we will email it out. So if you're not on that mailing list, please drop us a line and we can add you to that. And yes, just thank you so much, Sarah, for coming and giving your time and expertise to us.
Thanks to everyone for lovely comments and for listening to me talk at you for an hour. I really appreciate it.
Not at all, not at all. It was really insightful. And I think I just have to end. I'll let the thank yous come in a little bit more.
Oh, lovely thank yous. That's what you need on a Monday.